kind of been pimping memoir. When everybody talked about it as this kind of degraded, humiliating, awful genre, just cheap and trashy and riven with lies. All memoirs live and die, I think, based 100% on voice. Voice is the big bandwidth cable that permits a writer to download her experience into the reader's head and heart. Finding a way of sounding that's very particular to you, doesn't sound like anybody else. Finding that voice really grows out of finding that tractor beam of truth inside yourself. So, I mean, you don't have to be an art monster, as someone once called Nabokov. I do think it is a more democratic genre than fiction, certainly as fiction is practiced now, where it's very dystopic and fabulous and pretty embroidered. We live in an age where all our external sources of authority, the church or science or the government or these great heroes who are our presidents, as those icons have fallen, subjectivity has a new authority. There's something about saying, I don't know what really happened, but this is what I remember, that I think readers trust now more than somebody coming to them saying, I have the capital T truth about an event. I think those things have driven memoir in this century into the light and broadened the readership for them. And again, I think if you hold yourself to a higher standard of truth not just, did my mother shoot at my stepfather or not? That undeniably happened. There was no time in my life when she would have said, no, that didn't happen. My take on it was different. There was a period in my life when I was really angry, most at my parents, but mostly at my mother. Long before I wrote a memoir, I was able to see her as kind of a poor thing. The Liars Club is kind of a story of how I came to see the pain in her, so that I could kind of look at her through adult eyes suddenly and see the child in her. So when I was a young poet, I wanted to write these kind of super intellectual poems with all these references to philosophy and other paintings, and it was like a kind of strap-on identity that the poems were going to make manifest in the world. On my 30th birthday, I was flying back from San Francisco from a work thing, and I just scrawled out this, sort of vomited out all night on this red eye flying back, my grief over my father's dying. He'd had a stroke and he was just withering away. It was so awful to watch over a 5-year period. And my husband, I would have thrown the pages away, but he said, I was wondering when you were going to start writing about this. So the idea that you can choose your style or even your subject, it's a great idea. It's a very American idea, but for most artists know, you're kind of doomed to do what you're talented at. George Saunders, when he was in the MFA program at Syracuse, was very enamored with Toby Wolfe and Ray Carver and what was then called dirty realism. Saunders' talent is more in the line of Isaac Babel or Nikolai Gogol or Gabriel Garcia Marquez. He's a fabulist. He's a guy with this tremendous imagination, and to tether him to reality and these little short truncated sentences would be to bleed him of what makes him a unique human being. You really want your students to have a talent for their talent. And usually everybody has an idea about what's cool or what being an artist is for them. And it's usually, the younger they are, the more exactly opposite from how they are. So I had this super nice, very tender-hearted kid who wrote these kind of mean, badass, ironic poems. And I had this girl who was ashamed to write love poems because she thought they were corny. But I was like, you're 24 years old, you're getting slapped around in the love department. Why wouldn't you write about that? Like wanting to kiss people who don't want to kiss you, or wanting your parents to show up and they don't show up, or wanting to get to sleep and you're awake all night, or wanting to be, 5'9" with big boobs and you're, 5'5" flat-chested. The myth is it's whoever has the worst life writes the best memoir. But if that were true, then every genocide survivor, Holocaust survivor, would have a zillion copy bestseller, and nothing that bad ever happened to me, you know. Often it's just surviving these bad times. They're about these bad times, you know, Primo Levi, survival at Auschwitz. You know, the guy got out of Auschwitz. I adored my family. No one who's ever read any of my books thinks anything except that I just held them all in the highest regard. You know, my mother, my father, my sister, they're so smart and so odd and so interesting and passionate and vigorous, and I adored them. So I think you choose memoir or fiction really based on your nature. What form interests you the most? I once suggested Don DeLillo write a memoir, and he looked like a slug you'd thrown salt on. He just like recoiled. I started teaching memoir in 1986, 87 at Emerson and Tufts. And even the poetry class I taught at Harvard University was confessional poets like Robert Lowell, or people writing very much, Sylvia Plath, people writing very much out of their own personal experience. I haven't read other books about memoir that I've found very useful. I was lucky enough to meet and know a lot of really great memoirists, Jeffrey and Tobias Wolff, Frank Conroy, Maxine Hong Kingston, John Edgar Wideman, Frank McCourt. The Truth Ambush issue. My second book, Cherry, opens when I'm leaving with a bunch of drug dealers and heads to go off to California to surf and do narcotics. And I had always told my story like my daddy had left me and abandoned me. We'd been super close and he had sort of abandoned me. And so I'm writing this very poignant goodbye scene, which I remember, and I do remember being very sad saying goodbye to him, and I remember trying not to cry and trying to get over crying before I got in the truck with my friends because I was embarrassed. And so I said, okay, so you've always had this feeling your daddy left you. When did he leave you? You know, my parents divorced. They asked me and my sister who we wanted to live with, and we said my mother, because she looked like she needed more help than Daddy did. But even as I got older, he would still ask me to go hunting and fishing, but I was like too cool to go. I was reading Nietzsche and, you know, trying to get the boys who were reading Nietzsche to ask me on a date or whatever the hippie version of a date was. So I left him. Despite all the therapy I'd been in and all the times I'd examined my life, the sadness was really my guilt over leaving him. I never called him and he didn't show up. I never asked him to do something and had him not appear. You know, I'd be working this stupid job I had at this all-night switchboard, and he'd bring me a little supper plate covered over in foil. So all that sweetness of his love for me kind of had been blocked off from how I looked at my past because I was so invested in seeing him as this terrible, abandoning force in my life. So every book I've ever written, I've had to revise my view on my history. I try to keep the focus on myself when I'm interpreting. I try not to interpret what other people do. Like, I never call my parents alcoholics. You know, I described pouring vodka bottles down the kitchen sink. Not to make reductive statements about other people, but to give evidence for your opinions. In a strange way, you want to get so deep inside the experience that you're almost out of the way. For me, it's being willing to rewrite and rewrite and rewrite, not because whole different things happen, but I think a period of my life was all about one thing, and it turns out it was all about another. One reason I'm associated with memoirs so strongly, or that my memoirs have done so well, was that I used to play a game when I would go on the road. I would think, how little can I talk about myself? Because I just wanted the books to speak for themselves. I didn't really. So whoever interviewed me, I would say, what makes you so interested, you think, in this story? Or has anything like this ever happened in your childhood? Or was your adolescence kind of drug-addled? And I would get the newspaper people talking to me. So I think they all wrote really well about me because I came off as so interested in them. For Liars Club, Cherry, and Lit, when I went on the road, I spent a lot of time talking about books I loved. Maybe because I teach memoir for a living and poetry, and so I'm used to talking about other things, and I'm more comfortable with that than sort of reiterating stuff I've already written down. But I think because I've been such a champion of the genre. Richard Wright's Black Boy is, I think, started I think came out in the middle of the last century, I think started the real memoir craze. Nabokov's Speak Memory, Maxine Hong Kingston's Woman Warrior, Stop Time by Frank Comrie, Maya Angelou, I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings. It really isn't a how-to book, though. I mean, I've got to say, I hope people writing memoirs, the how-to stuff is kind of put in like pepper. It's like there's a little here and little there. There are these little short, pithy chapters like how to deal with your family. And then there's like a list of things I would do. And so those are things that a general reader could really just ignore. I think anybody with a past or a family who has an inner life. I mean, there are people who are just shallow, who just think, oh, all that happened a long time ago. And I'm still trying to figure out how I got here and what the hell's going on and find a way to process my experience.